Russian President Vladimir Putin signed a decree simplifying the procedure of getting the Russian citizenship for people living in temporarily occupied parts of Ukraine's Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Ukraine's main diplomat and Foreign Affairs Minister Pavlo Klimkin has called it a new stage of the Russian occupation of Donbas.
The Kremlin says it's a purely humanitarian move.
We have no desire to create problems for the new Ukrainian leadership, but we cannot tolerate a situation where people living on the territories of Donetsk and Luhansk republics are generally deprived of civil rights.
Ukraine's outgoing president Petro Poroshenko denounced Moscow's latest move, saying it was in clear violation of the Minsk ceasefire agreements.
This is another unprecedented act of Russia's interference into internal affairs of an independent country. It's a brutal violation of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of Ukraine.
President France firmly condemns Russia's decision to facilitate the granting of Russian nationality to Ukrainian citizens living in certain areas of the Ukrainian Oblast, Donetsk and Luhansk. By acting in this way, Russia is deliberately dealing a blow to the spirit of the Minsk agreements. The decision to facilitate the granting of Russian passports to Ukrainian citizens is a flagrant attack on Ukrainian sovereignty. The so-called humanitarian arguments cited by Russia are unfounded. Several million people currently need humanitarian aid in Ukraine, but the de facto separatist authorities are continuing to impede access by humanitarian organizations to the territories under their control.
Thank you, Mr. President. The United States also condemns Russia's decision to grant expedited Russian citizenship to Ukrainians living in the Russian-controlled Donbas. Through this highly provocative action, Russia is clearly intensifying its assault on Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Mr. President, Donbas is Ukraine, and the people there are Ukrainian, regardless of which language they prefer to speak. Conferring citizenship en masse to the citizens of another state undermines and violates the principles of sovereignty. Russia's actions subvert the principles on which the Minsk agreements are based, that the Donbas is an integral part of Ukraine, and that the Ukrainian government must reestablish its control over this territory. Mr. President, if Russia were truly interested in the well-being of Russian-speaking citizens of Ukraine, it would seize this moment to chart a new course in Russia-Ukraine relations and seek to work with President Poroshenko and his successor to promote peace. Instead, Russia further fuels a conflict that has already claimed over 13,000 lives. Mr. President, we once again affirm that our Donbas-related sanctions will remain in place until Russia withdraws its forces from eastern Ukraine and implements the Minsk agreements. Our Crimea-related sanctions will remain in place until Russia returns control of the peninsula to Ukraine. I thank you, Mr. President.
On the 24th of April, the Russian president signed a decree aimed at facilitating the granting of Russian nationality to the populations residing in certain areas in the Ukrainian Oblast of Luhansk and Donetsk. We condemn this unilateral measure. Not only does it run contrary to the spirit of the Minsk agreements, but it also runs the risk of exacerbating tensions between the parties. We recall that for Belgium, the Minsk agreements remains the only pathway to arrive at a lasting political solution to this conflict.
Mr. President, Poland strongly condemns Russia's decision to provide expedited Russian citizenship to the Ukrainian citizens living in Russia-controlled areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions in Ukraine. Mr. President, it also must be emphasized that international law does not allow for the widespread naturalization of nationals of another state who reside in that other state's territory. Such an action is a clearly illegal act of coercion against Ukraine, which should be considered as another measure of escalation of Ukrainian-Russian conflict. Therefore, the international community should not accept nor recognize such a cascade of disregard for the international law, fundamental principles, and should respond accordingly to Russia's unacceptable and illegal behavior. 13,000 people have died. 30,000 have been injured. 3.5 million are in need of humanitarian aid in this modern conflict in Europe. Mr. President, why are we here? We're here because Russia sent troops to Crimea and later grabbed it after an illegitimate pretense of a referendum held at the barrel of the Russian gun. Russia's actions were clearly illegal. 100 member states agreed in a GA resolution in March 2014, and not one country around this table voted with Russia. Russia sent troops and supported separatists in eastern Ukraine and continues to destabilize those regions with devastating humanitarian consequences. Russia attacked Ukrainian ships in the Sea of Azov last year and continues to impose daily restrictions on vessels in a blatant attempt to destabilize Ukraine's economy. All those who care about the territorial integrity of member states and the principle of non-interference should ask Moscow to stop interfering in its neighbor and to get off its territory. We therefore condemn President Putin's recent decision on passports, which is further evidence of Russia's aggressive actions to destabilize Ukraine and undermine her security, sovereignty, and territorial integrity.
Chapter 15 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that no one can be arbitrarily stripped of citizenship or the right to change citizenship. We do know what Vladimir Yurovich of Ukraine is going to say in his statement, that this is interference in the internal affairs of Ukraine, flagrant violation of international law, creeping annexation of Donbas, creating the opportunity to question the ownership over that. Let me tell him right away, Vladimir Yurovich, all of that has nothing to do with the reality. We're not interfering in the internal affairs of Ukraine. We're not involved in creeping annexation. We're simply providing people with an opportunity to resolve the drastically important issues for them. And this is because the Kievan authorities are refusing to do that. And by doing that, they are violating the Minsk agreements. And the people will themselves decide whether they take up this right or not.
First, I would like on substance to align myself with the statement made by my French colleague. In the Normandy format, we work very closely together and subscribe to everything he has said. Vasily, I just listened to your statement, and I must admit I'm really fascinated by, always been fascinated by Russian diplomacy. Another part of the textbooks in Russia is that don't miss a moment for cynicism. So your president, President Putin, signed the decree on the passports on the 24th of April. The 24th of April, yesterday, was the International Day of Multilateralism, the day where here in the General Assembly we all spoke about multilateralism, the need to obey, to follow an international to follow an international rules-based order. So by this, you demonstrated your disdain for the international rules-based order.
I thank the members of the Security Council who condemned the legitimate decree of the Russian president. I only wish the briefers be more focused on this particular issue, which is the main purpose of today's meeting, but I will try to fill this gap. You have already heard the Russian try of selling this decree to the wider UN membership. As usual, and you already mentioned this, dear Christoph, Russian-style subversive diplomacy you've got used to here in this council, namely cynical misinterpretation, manipulation, lies, and disinformation. I'm fascinated, as usual, by the gift of foresight of Vasily, who knows in advance what I'm going to say. Just look at this. Only yesterday, when Putin was signing the decree, his foreign minister was delivering a statement at the, just imagine, Moscow Conference on International Security. Such a nice title. And I quote him, "We hope the new Ukrainian leadership will realize its responsibility and will contribute to the settlement of the crisis by fully implementing the Minsk package of measures within contact group and Normandy format in full accordance with the Security Council Resolution 2202. Germany and France will have to play an important role not to let the attempts to review the Minsk agreements. End of quote. Shall we take it that the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing? I doubt it. This is the usual behavior of Russia, double-speak and putting blame on others. On 26 November 2018, speaking before this Council, I compared the Russian aggression in Ukraine to the Soviet dirty war against its neighbor in 1939. Unfortunately, history seems to be repeating itself. The Russian Federation is steadily embarking on the same road that led to the expulsion of the USSR from the League of Nations. Now let's come back to the situation in the Ukrainian Donbas. Distributing en masse Russian passports in that region could be easily used by the Kremlin for legitimizing its military presence in the Ukrainian territory to protect would-be Russian citizens. The Kremlin's decision is a clear proof that Moscow is choosing the same scenario. This is nothing else but a thinly veiled attempt to vindicate the ongoing occupation of these territories, to wrest them from Ukraine and dismember my country. This is nothing else but an artificial pretext to continue sending Russian troops to Ukraine and sustain the undisguised military aggression against my country. This is nothing else but a premeditated and concerted effort to undercut prospects for a peace settlement on the basis of full and proper implementation of the Minsk agreements. Indeed, the illegitimate decree of the Russian president completely undermines the logic of the Minsk agreements and, in fact, makes their implementation hardly possible. Judge for yourself. The purpose of the Minsk agreements is reintegration of the temporarily occupied areas of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions into the legal, political, and economic space of Ukraine. Instead, the logic of the said decree is disintegration and consolidation of the total Russian control over the occupied territories. Aren't these clear signs of a creeping annexation? Importantly, distributing Russian passports in the occupied territories will make it hardly possible to conduct their legitimate local elections in accordance with the Ukrainian legislation and relevant OSCE standards under the OSCE ODIHR monitoring as envisaged by the Minsk agreements. I also have a specific question to Ambassador Nebenza. I will ask it in Russian. Vasily,
will you also find nothing unusual in a situation where the citizens of border areas in Russia are being given by other states their passports en masse in an organized fashion? This is instead of the story about how difficult life has become for the people in Donbas.
Leadership realize that its actions totally disrupt the Minsk agreements. Doesn't Russia realize that what kind of a ticking time bomb it plants? Doesn't Russia realize its political responsibility for undermining the process of peaceful settlement in the eastern part of Ukrainian Donbas? I think the Kremlin realizes all this very well, but does it on purpose. Implementation of the said agreements was never the intention of the Russian side. Destabilization and fragmentation of Ukraine was a crystal clear intent behind every move during the last 5 years.